Hi guys, welcome to you all again. So in this lecture, I am going to create the part 5 of this current microservices playlist, and I'm going to take out the customer microservice, the shell that we have created from the project template in the part 2, and we'll take it further and complete the microservice using Dapper Micro ORM and Swagger in ASP.NET 5. So what we are going to learn today is the introduction to the Dapper Micro ORM, what is Swagger, add NuGet package to the ASP.NET 5 Customer.Microservice WebAPI created in part 2, and use an existing MS-SQL database and a customer table in the database, create the customer model, create the customer controller, create the connection string in appsettings.json, and reading the data from the database table, insert, update, and delete records. Now for the above CRUD operations, this insert, update, delete and data retrieval, we'll create the action methods in the customer controller. So here are the NuGet packages for the customer microservice. In the following NuGet packages are required: Dapper, system.data.sql client, and a few packages are added automatically, as we'll see in this diagram: Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer, and these three are automatically added, including the swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core, while creating the project that configures and uses Swagger UI by default, because we have kept the Open ID Connect checkbox checked. All right. So having got the first few slides out of the way, let's see what is a Dapper. The Dapper is an object relational mapping for the .NET platform. It's also a micro ORM, unlike the Entity Framework Core, which is a much expanded and advanced ORM. The Dapper Micro ORM is this, you can say, the bare bone basics. It actually efficiently maps the .NET object to the entities in the SQL database, and it provides a framework for mapping an object-oriented domain model to a traditional relational database. Now, Dapper is created by experts behind the Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange, you know, stackoverflow.com, where you are all familiar with. It is a platform that solves the problems of the developers, okay, by experts. Now, Dapper provides a mapping between databases and .NET objects. It owns the title of king of micro ORM in terms of speed, and is as fast as using a raw edu.NET data reader. And it extends the IDB connection by providing useful extension methods to query our database. Since it is a micro ORM, it is an ORM that is extremely lightweight and gives only very basic functionality, as I was telling just now. Whereas we might class something like Entity Framework or NHibernate as a fully featured heavyweight ORM. Dapper provides minimal overhead and really only helps you out with some core basics. So when to use Dapper? While deciding whether to use Dapper or not, one should bear in mind the primary reasons for its existence, that is the performance. The original developers of Dapper were using Entity Framework Core's predecessor, which is the link to SQL. They found that query performance wasn't good enough for increasing traffic, that the site in question, I mean, the Stack Overflow itself, was experiencing a heavy increasing traffic every day. So the query performance wasn't good enough. It was not able to catch up with the increasing traffic. So they wrote their own micro ORM. Now, Dapper is therefore a good choice in scenarios where read-only data changes frequently and is requested often. It is particularly good in stateless scenarios, that is the web, where there is no need to persist complex object graphs in memory for any duration. Dapper doesn't translate queries written in .NET languages to SQL like a full-blown ORM, so you need to be comfortable writing queries in SQL or have someone write them for you. And what is this Swagger tool? Now, in the one of my previous lectures, probably it was the part 4, where I created you know, a product microservice with CQRS pattern, that is command query responsibility segregation pattern, that uses entity framework code. We have already seen how the Swagger tool works, or Swagger is integrated. Now, this project will also have a Swagger tool from Swashbuckle to test the responses corresponding to user requests instead of using Postman. So, Swagger is a tool for documentation as well as testing of responses integrated with the application without having to use an external tool like Postman. It is very easy to handle and easily integrates with your project in Visual Studio. And Swagger UI allows anyone, be it your development team or your end consumers, to visualize and interact with the API's resources without having any of the implementation logic in place. And it is automatically generated from your Open API, formerly known as Swagger specification, with the visual documentation, making it easy for backend implementation and client-side consumption. So having said all that, let's switch over to Visual Studio and we'll explain everything plus running the application with Swagger. Now, this is the customer microservice in this microservices.webapi, which has got a couple of other projects like product.microservice and gateway.api. So this project was created earlier in the part 2. So I strongly suggest for those of you who have missed that, who are new to this lecture, please go through the first couple of lectures because this is built upon the last two parts. Okay, so let's see. We have already created a customer microservice with bare bone basics, just the Microsoft template for Web API core, and these were the uh, packages that were installed by default, which is what I showed you in the slideshow here. So these were the three packages automatically installed when you keep the checkbox checked with OpenID Connect. All right, and let's see these two NuGet packages have to be installed now, Dapper and system.data.sql client. So let's switch over to Visual Studio again. So for adding the NuGet packages, the easiest way to, if you want to avoid issuing command manually from package manager console, is to right click the customer microservice and manage NuGet packages and look for, this already opens, that's beneficial for us, it saves time. So look for Dapper and click on this Dapper by Sam Saffron and click on install. So Dapper is now installed because you can see uninstall button, and if you look into the installed tab, you can see Dapper is already installed. Now click on browse, and which one was the other one? The other that was left to be installed was system dot data dot SQL client. Okay, so on the top, click on install, accept the license, and we can see here that system.data.sql client is also installed. Now going back to the learning outcome, we can see after adding the NuGet package, use an existing SQL database and a customer table in the database, which I have already created. But I will put the code for creating the customer table within the database. So let's go to the SQL Server Management Studio. Now SQL Server is open in front of me, and I will click on connect with Windows authentication and the server name, and it is opened, and I have created this database customer DB, in which there is a table customer table dbo.customer, and I have put some records. If you click on select top 1000 rows, there are a few records in the customer table. It is preloaded, but I will show you everything, how to create a new record, how to update, and delete and retrieve. Okay, so a few records are there already, 8. Now back to Visual Studio project, and I will close this NuGet Packages window, and then I will create a models folder in which I will create the customer model. So right click and add new folder. So models folder, and then right click again to add a class. So this is the customer class, and I will rewrite the customer class with the copied code on my clipboard to save time again. And this has got a few fields along with ID, which is a primary key and which is actually auto incrementing with a seed value of 1, an auto increment of 1, which you can get from the SQL server. So if you look into the table design for a second, columns, okay. If you look into the design of this customer table, so ID, just expand it a bit, and identity specification, yes, and just expand it. Is identity, yes, in identity increment 1, identity seed is also 1. All right. So let's go back to our customer class. Now in the controllers folder, by default, there is one weather forecast controller, which is not of much use. So I'll right click that. I'll let it be there without deleting and add another controller, and this controller will be API controller with read write actions. Okay, and click on add. Name it customer controller. So it has got some minimal action methods create for you. Get, get with an ID, and post. So I will rewrite all of them one by one. But before I go for recreating or editing the customer controller action methods, it is high time that we create the connection string in the appsettings.json. So appsettings.json is the configuration file, that's the JSON file, and here just above the allowed hosts, I will create the connection string, and this is the default connection. I will name it default connection. You can name it anything. Okay, and the data source is whatever is the data source that is actually got from here. This is the data source. If you are not sure, just click on connect once more, database engine. This is my server, that is the data source is the server. All right, so back here, and laptop slash slash SQL Express and initial catalog, that is the database name, that is the customer DB, and integrated security to true is Windows authentication. Okay, now another way of finding out the connection string is to right click, add SQL server, and Windows authentication username is this, and server name you can look for local servers. This was, you can see, laptop SQL Express. You can confirm from here, laptop slash SQL Express, whatever be the laptop name, backslash SQL Express. And if you look for the database name, you can see that customer DB is already there. And if you click on connect, it will be server is also connected on the SQL Server Object Explorer within Visual Studio. And if you um, click on the databases node, you have this customer DB. And if you just click left click there, and you can see the connection string also present over here. Connection string. Okay, so this is the complete connection string. You can see that I have done it on the on my mouse over, and you can also copy and paste. There are quite a few other um, properties but I have actually picked up the just basic things like connect, timeout, etc. are not needed. Um, Trust server certificate equals false, applicant intent read write. So you can put the entire connection string from here to here, but I have kept the bare bone basics because I know what is absolutely needed. Okay, let's close this window. And as you may all be aware that this connection string is the actual connection string depending upon my server and the database name, and it will vary from user to user. It will be obviously not the same in your case. Now let's come back to the customer controller. We have already created the customer controller, and let's write the action methods. And I've already added the system.data.sql client, which is must for this. Now for getting the data from the database table, I'll paste the following code in here. Uh, just it's how to get all the customers. Okay, so SQL connection, I'll have to use a potential fix using system.data.sql client. So now this has been fixed by this using statement, and this is connection string. It will come from. So let's create the connection string in the class level, and this will be a private field, read only, because connection string need only to be read, private only string. So I'll have to use this, the default connection. This is the connection string. Actually, this is the connection string part. So here I will write it within double quotes. Everything should be there, and semicolon to terminate. Right, this is the connection string now. So this squiggly line is gone, and for this query async, use the Dapper. Okay, using Dapper. That is the NuGet package that we have created, and this is all about Dapper. Okay, this is using Dapper. Yeah, using Dapper. Now in this method, we are returning a list of enumerable object, customer object of customer type, which basically iterates over all the records in the customer table in the database and queries them with a SQL query. This is the SQL query. Select star from customer, which is most of you will be familiar with how to write a select query from in the SQL server. Okay, and the customers are returned as a result of passing the SQL query as a string to the query async method. Okay, and this is async and await. So this is asynchronous operation, asynchronously called this query async, and this does the magic. This is the Dapper part of it, query async method. Okay, it reads the data from the table, assigning it to the enumerable instance, which is the customers, which is enumerable of customers. This is models.customer. This is the fully qualified namespace. Okay, so models folder customer class. Okay, and then it returns the customers. Okay, the using statement here, the using statement ensures that the SQL connection object, which is opened earlier with the connection.open async, is disposed, okay, by calling the connection.dispose method in the invisibly behind the scene when you have done with the connection before it exits the using block. Okay, so in you can see here this connection is always open, but it is actually, if you experiment with play around with this block, you'll see that connection doesn't need to be open, because what happens is that connection is this Dapper makes sure that the connection, if it is not open, if it cannot see a statement like this, it automatically opens the connection asynchronously and it does the thing. But because you can say I am an old school person, or I feel that the connection, that the person who is responsible for opening the connection should open the connection explicitly by this statement. Okay, so henceforth I'll be always using this pattern. I'll be using the SQL connection object to create a new instance of SQL connection, passing the connection string, and then call the open async method to open the connection asynchronously. Now, if at this stage, if I click the IIS Express icon, this project is able to run and retrieve the result to this stage to get all the customers. So let's see. You can see that customer.microservice, it has this project is open with the Swagger tools, Swagger UI, and if I expand this node and click on try it out, click on execute, it's just loading, and it brings me all the results from the database. So these are the results, these are the records available which I have already filled and I've shown to you. 1 2 3 4, quite a few records are already there. So we'll stop that application now and let's get the connect customer, a single customer by ID parameter. So I will now just I will copy over the code in my clipboard and paste it over here and then save it. And this may also be quite familiar. So we are again creating a customer object and then using the SQL connection object and passing it the connection string, which is on top, accessible to every method in this controller class, and then again opening the connection asynchronously, and then select star from customer where ID equals @ID. So this is, you can say, those of you who are familiar with the stored procedure concept of ADO.NET, this is very it is the same command, you can say, a query, SQL query, and this is the parameter. Now this ID parameter is passed to it from the Swagger UI. So that we are going to see in a second. And then again, it is calling here it is now calling a query single async in contrast to the query async to get the list. Here we are going to get a single result filtered by the ID, and we are passing this SQL query, and here this new ID equals ID, it means this this part is actually is an anonymous class containing the properties that will map to the parameters of the query, that will map to the parameters of this SQL query. Okay, let's run the application once more to see. So application is open in front of me, and if you click on get to see what are the IDs available, and then use one of the IDs to get that particular record by that particular ID. So let's see ID 3. Okay, so come down and the result was success. You can see here the response body and response header, and this is the request URL. This is the requested URL that is being automatically done through Swagger UI. Although you can see here it is swagger/index.html, but actual requested URL is appearing over here along with the response body and response header, and the response code is success. Okay, now get with an ID. This is the requested URL, and if you click on try it out again and place the ID over here, let's see ID 3 and then click on execute. So you get the ID 3, the record with an ID 3, name, ID, address, telephone, email. Okay. Now for the post operation or creating a or inserting a new record, we again use the HTTP post verb, and I will write over the entire action method, which I have copied again and then Control S to save it. It's also very similar. This part is quite familiar. And here, the parameter that is getting for this customer type or customer object of customer type is from the body. It's from the body of the request. Okay. And again, the SQL query is insert into customer name, address, telephone, email field, these values at name, at address, at telephone, at email. These are the parameters, and it will be supplied again through the user by the through the Swagger UI. And to the connection string, you are this Dapper is calling the execute async method and passing in the SQL query statement and the customer object, and it returns an OK. So let's see the create method in action. So if you click on post and if you click on try it out, you can create a um, request over here, and no need to put the ID because the ID is actually automatically generated in the that is what we have configured in a SQL server. So name string, so you can get any name, say Emily, address, any address. Okay, and telephone, just to quickly test. So I have not given any validation, any fluent validation, which I would actually hate to do while working on production, because any UI block, I mean data type that is being sent to the server, posted to the server, should always be validated. So I will take the fluent validation in another lecture. This is out of the scope. It will be very big, so I have omitted this out. So let's see, Emily at whatever. Now click on execute. Okay, and then code is success. And then if you click on the get, try it out, click on execute, you should be able to get the end last record inserted, that is Emily. All right. Now, if you get back to the code again, you see all of these methods, special methods, query single, async, execute async, or query async. These are all extension methods that the Dapper uses. Okay, from the system.data.sql client namespace. Now, execute async is an extension method used by Dapper, and it returns the number of rows affected. You can see the number of rows affected. It and it takes the SQL query and the customer object. You can see the next available ID is automatically given, even though while testing we have left the ID column as 0. All right. So insert query is also out of the way, and so are the get and get by ID. So we have got update and delete to do. So I will just copy over the update method, which is an HTTP put type of verb with ID passed uh, from the body. From body of the response, we pass the customer object and also an int ID, with which the record has to be first found out from the database, and then it will be updated. And again, this is the using statement, which is uh, passed a connection string, again the top one, this one, and uh, it is opened asynchronously just to avoid opening it uh, by the Dapper, and so that we have control over the connection string. And the using statement is again used so that by the time it quits the using statement, the connection is disposed automatically, and it is collected by the garbage collector, so that we unnecessarily don't accumulate a lot of memory. Okay, so again, um, this is the SQL query, the normal SQL query: update customer, set name equals at name, address equals at address, or whichever parameters you want to update, you can pass it over here. There's no need to absolutely pass all of these parameters. You can just selectively use choose to pass just one or two or three parameters The choice is yours. And then execute async, just like the create or inserting record into the database. You are calling the execute async for the update records also, and passing the SQL query as well as the customer. So this part is very similar to the create record or insert a new record into the customer database. So this is the put or update operation. So here you can see that I have left the telephone field unupdated. So intentionally, just to show you the point, because now if I'm going to update all other fields, every other field that is actually in the query here will be updated except the telephone, even if I try to update it. Okay. Now the browser screen is again in front of me, and then this is the put operation for updating API slash customer slash the ID. And if I click on try it out, and then request body is this, just for helping you in supplying only the parameters, the values, not the keys. So if I just put an ID, say, let's say 2, and here this is where it matters, ID 2, and name, whatever was the name, let's see. You can try it out to see, fetch all the records. So ID2, I am actually trying to update. Name was Arturo, address was this, telephone was this, and email was this. Okay, so I'll actually update name, address, and email. Okay, so name, so you will see that telephone field will not be updated. So let us click on execute, and response is, this is the code 200 success result. Remember ID equals 2, and if I get by ID, if I test this one with this ID, try it out. ID is 2, click on execute. You can see that ID is 2, Robbie, name, address is changed, telephone number is still the same, email address is changed. So telephone, I have given telephone, I have 1 2 1 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 0, and this is actually original telephone number, which was not changed because we have not updated the telephone field over here. Okay, so just stop the application. Now, one thing has to be pointed out in put operation with Swagger is that, if this ID field, required ID field, now if I write here 5 and I just want to write something else, ID is 3, and whatever is the name, address, and telephone I need to update, and email. So this will be actually from the request body overrides the ID that I am giving from this ID field. So even if it is ID 5, it will only update the record with the ID as 3. Okay, so let's go for the delete operation. So delete code was already written for me, this shell of a code, shell of a action method. So I just delete the stub and write it over with the code that I had. So delete operation, it takes an int ID, and it actually, again, these two lines are exactly the same, and this is delete customer, where ID equals @ID, which is again uh, got from here. This is actually anonymous class which has got an ID parameter which is supplied from the request, from the HTTP delete request, and it actually carries out an execute async, which is again an extension method within a Dapper, and it um, deletes the record and returns an OK. So if you click on IIS Express, again open the Swagger tool. Now you have got all these records with these different IDs. So let's delete one of them, ID2, ID3, ID4. These are all records available. And if you click on the delete and try it out, ID3, execute. Okay, again, start another one, ID4, execute. So all are, this is server response is 200. This is the success. And let's see the customer get to see these are executed or not. So if you click on execute, so you can see that 3 and 4, which we have deleted, are not there. So after 2, it is straight away to 6, ID 6. So we have seen that, how to create the customer microservice with Dapper and Swagger tool. And one thing to remember here is that, Swagger is automatically configured in the startup class once you pick up this OpenID Connect. So if you wish to see that in action, just stop this application, because I did nothing to configure the startup. It's automatically configured for you. Services.add swaggergen. This part, c.swaggerdoc version 1, new open API info. Title is this, version is this, and again in the this middleware, this app.use swagger UI. This is the middleware configured, right? So that's how this customer microservice was created from scratch. Thanks for joining me.